My name is Brittany Brathwaite, and I'll be your moderator today. Okay. Our session today is entitled Sexual Harassment, a Modern Workplace Dilemma. I beg to differ with that title. It was thought up earlier. And I beg to differ on the basis that I believe this is not a modern workplace dilemma. I think this was age-old. I think it's been around for a long time. And what it differs now in this century is the fourth frontal attack that employers, in conjunction with government, is taking in tackling this issue. We have the government with the impending sexual harassment bill. We have employers who have now implemented, and strategically so, policies, sexual harassment policies. We have grievance handling procedures for these things. All of these things were foreign to employers in the past, and the topic was a very taboo topic. So I do ask, and I urge you to ask as many questions as you want today. We are going to have Mr. Victor Felix, who is on my right, speaking to the sexual harassment bill. He's from the Ministry of Labour. So ask Mr. Felix as many questions as you want. You have him for 2 hours today. And let me just introduce our panel, starting from my far right, Mrs. Diana Douglas. I already told the panel, so I won't be reading their full bios today. But she is Human Resources Director at the Williams Industries, and she manages over 700 persons, so she has a wide array of persons to manage, males and females. We also have Ms. Wilma Clement, who is the Assistant General Secretary at the Barbados Workers Union. We have Mr. Ralph Boyce, President of MISA, Mrs. Marilyn Rice Bowen, President of NOW, and we have Mr. Victor Felix, who is the Deputy Chief Labour Officer, Ministry of Labour. Okay, we are going to begin with a presentation from Ms. Diana Douglas. So just so you have a running order of everything, the presentations are going to be 10 minutes long each. And then we're going to have an open question and answer segment. So I urge you, have your papers and pens, write as many questions. So when we get to that segment, I'm not asking all the questions and we hear from you guys.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. The topic, sexual harassment, a workplace dilemma. One of the reasons why it is a dilemma, we have to understand what a dilemma is. A dilemma is when you have really no good choice to make, or you have to choose between the lesser of two evils. And that is a situation with sexual harassment in the workplace for many, many people right now. Why is sexual harassment still a dilemma in the workplace? Because we know that the legislation has not been passed as yet. There's no rules and regulations to govern it from a legal standpoint. Of course, this is something that Mr. Felix will be speaking to. And another one of the problems is that there are few workplace policies that exist. So some workplaces have sexual harassment policies and some do not. And some of the ones that have sexual harassment policies, they don't enforce them as they should. And so, of course, you have a dilemma there where people would have issues, they would take them to the HR or to the general manager, and these would not be sorted as they should be. The other problem that we have with sexual harassment is that a lot of what is considered to be sexual harassment is like normal, every day. It's a cultural thing people say. And we'll look at some of these issues, and there really are no programs that are addressing these normal behaviors, which really are sexual harassment, really, when you look at it. The other thing that I've mentioned here is that one of the dilemmas is that you find that when you go to deal with sexual harassment cases, you have what is called a band of brothers or band of sisters, or however you want to look at it. It's male or female now, where you're investigating a sexual harassment case, but people band together because they have something on each other, so they can't afford to give up this information. And I've actually come across that in the past in dealing with sexual harassment cases where you pretty much know that something did happen, but you're unable to get all of the information because people band together and they won't give up the information. And so, how do we define sexual harassment in the workplace? Well, there are lots of ways. All those unwanted jokes and gestures, and by gestures, it's not just your hand gestures, it could be your facial expression, the way people look at you. We've all experienced it from in one time or another. And let me be very clear, I'm looking at this from a male and female standpoint. It's not just male on female, or it goes both ways these days. It used to be very much male to female, but it's very mixed right now. All these different, sometimes you would go into, I've been into a media house, in fact, where somebody had on their shirt, it was quite offensive, but obviously they might say, well, if you don't look at it, so it wouldn't seem offensive to me. Or you would go in a shop or something, and they have all of the posters on the wall with all of the calendars and the naked people. Well, I mean, it's up to you. You either stay and buy what you want, or you leave if you take offense. But some of these things are creeping into the workplace, into our offices, where people would have these pictures. They may say things to you that really borderline sexual harassment or outright sexual harassment. And then you get the direct stuff where people actually come and touch you. They have to feel you up, and they have to, you know, and they're thinking, well, you know, it's just touching you, but you're very uncomfortable with this, because really and truly, this is sexual harassment. They may grab you around your waist. Male and females, they touch other people's behinds. They meant to do it. They linger. Their hands linger in places where they should never linger. And all of that is sexual harassment. Or you happen to walk past your workmate's desk, and every time you walk past your workmate's desk, you hear Marvin Gaye, Sexual Healing comes on, and it's only for you. Now, you might think, well, some of these things are very hard to prove, but this is sexual harassment, really. But it's difficult sometimes to prove it. Sometimes people may send you emails, or, you know, something on Facebook or something, and it's pertaining to you, or something that it's not even pertaining to you. You don't want to see this thing, but where they keep sending it to you, why are they doing that? And we hope that when we get the legislation that it addresses a lot of these things, but without the legislation as well, workplace policies have to address all of these issues with a very broad stroke. So when we can move just to the pictures, this is some of what I'd mentioned before. Somebody touching you. Now, you could just be touching on your shoulder. Now, it could be a female on a male, or it could be a male on a female. And if you look at the picture at the bottom, you see the young lady is cornered there. That happens very often in the workplace. One that I dealt with a couple of years ago, a young lady went to the bathroom, and the corridor coming from the bathroom is very narrow. And the boyfriend of one of her co-workers was harassing her all the time. And he stopped her in the corridor, and he had his hands on had her between his hands on the wall, and she was very, very afraid. She took it to her manager, and he said, "Oh, you know, I think you just take it easy. It's all right. He didn't mean anything by it." And yet, a couple of days later, he meets her outside after his girlfriend has moved on, and he's telling her all the things that he would like to do to her. So this is such a real thing. And then at the top, this is more, I think, one of the most common things when you walk past someone and they have to undress you with their eyes, and they look you up and down, and that is sexual harassment as well, which I think that's without saying. Okay. So let's even define it a little bit more. It's those nonverbal things that happen, you know, the way that people look at you, their facial expressions, and you can tell that they're trying to determine what color underwear you have on, or what size you are, you know. Or you're passing somebody and you hear tss, tss, and then whatever else comes after that. I was trying to actually find a way to write it, so I put seats in there, and it's not a real word, but it's a real thing that happens. So seats in, yes, and sometimes people pass and they have to be licking their lips, and they're doing the LL Cool J lipping thing, because they're the best thing for you and you're the best thing for them. All right, so you have the nonverbal ones. Then you have the visual ones, where people actually expose themselves to people, and that is happening in the workplace. A few years ago, I went to investigate a case at a branch that fell under my management, and not only was the person exposing themselves and taking pictures of themselves, but on their computer they had over 1,000 pornographic files. And then during the daytime they would watch these movies, and anybody around them would have to see them, because you have cubicles behind the individual. Well, not really cubicles, you have desks. So you're trying to do your work, and then everything is right in front of you. So this is happening all the time. And then people dress sometimes explicitly to sexually arouse other people. And this happens from a male and a female standpoint. It doesn't matter who, it's across the board now. It's across the board. And sometimes people would tell you, well, you know, you shouldn't dress like this or you shouldn't dress like that. The question is, you know, who is doing it really to be, to harass you sexually? And this is, eventually we're going to come to that point about of a burden of proof, which bears a lot of weight when it comes to investigating sexual harassment cases. Then there's psychological harassment, and this is very, very difficult to prove, but it goes on, and it's happening all the time, where people do things that make people feel uncomfortable, and it doesn't seem as if it's happening to you directly, but really and truly it is. It is. How do you prove this? How do you get to the bottom of it? And there's quite a bit of sexual harassment stalking going on as well. And this is, people are being stalked and they don't even know they're being stalked. And how you find out sometimes is because cameras pick it up, or other people tell you that, you know, every time you go to the bathroom, this person is going to the bathroom too. So sometimes it's female on female or it's male on male. So it's a really, really expansive issue that is going on. And here we come to the burden of proof. Now, I have the term legally up there. I don't mind we don't have the laws yet. But in many, many cases where somebody accuses somebody of something, the burden of proof is on the victim to prove that this thing actually happened. And this is something people have to keep in mind. If you're going to go as far as accusing somebody of something, you need to get your proof together. And there are ways in which you can do that. And workplace policies can also assist in that. And I'm hoping that the legislation will also assist where that is concerned. The employer must have this policy and the employee must take advantage of it. The thing is too that there are some workplace policies that exist, the employees know nothing about them. And this is where employers, it's on the employers to make sure that all of their employees know about these workplace policies, the sexual harassment policies, so they're not disadvantaged. And then it's up to the employer to make sure that everybody sees this, they know how to operate with it, and that there's this level of confidentiality when this policy is enacted. So how do we solve this dilemma in the workplace? It's not easy to solve, but there are different steps that we can take. We have to have a no tolerance to sexual harassment in the workplace policy. There should be a policy statement that is shared with everyone. It should not be tolerated. There should be a level of confidentiality, especially in the HR department. And this is where our HR people need to really step up to the plate and respect people's confidentiality and people's privacy and follow the policy to the T. The sexual harassment policy must detail everything and must really outline as well that the investigation will be conducted like this, and this is what will happen. You will notice sometimes when you hear about cases that involve children, children are protected in the court, or they should be protected in the court, and they are not necessarily required to face their accuser. And these are things that have to be considered when you are developing your sexual harassment workplace policy, because some people can be so traumatized by what they've experienced that it is impossible for them to actually speak about what has happened in the presence of their accuser. And so there has to be ways in which we can get around hearing this individual's testimony. On the other hand now, the other side of the argument is that if somebody accuses you, you should be able to defend yourself. Because what if the accusation is a false accusation? And this is something that the workplace policy and legislation should address. What happens when people try to defame people for whatever reason by falsely accusing them of sexual harassment? And I give you one example of this that I've investigated, where a supervisor on his way to work, he would pick up staff, he would see them on the way, he would pick them up because they're all in the same direction. And a young lady got in his car, and now, of course, this is his word against hers and her word against his, but this is how the story went. She asked him for some money to help pay her bills. She needed to pay a light bill and a water bill, and she was short. And he says, well, you know, we can't do that. Now, his recounting of the matter was that she started to scratch herself and slap herself, and she tore up all her shirt, and he pulled over the car and he asked her to get out of the car, and she refused. And she continued to hit herself in the car, and he turned around and he drove right into Central Police Station and got out and explained everything to the police officer and said, look, I just want this lady out of my car. And that was it. It was solved there and then, because he really had no scratches on him and she was doing all of this to herself. But it can be worse. It could be worse than that. It could be way worse, because people can band together and accuse people wrongfully. So however you investigate sexual harassment, you have to do it with, you have to really, really get to the nitty-gritty of what really is going on here. And we need to train our managers and supervisors in terms of what is sexual harassment. It can't be, well, it's the culture to seats at people, it's the culture to look people up and down and undress them with the eyes. It can't be that anymore. That has to change. Yes, we don't have any programs that are fixing that at the moment, but within your workplace you have to set up that type of environment and you have to enforce it. Employees are encouraged then to use the workplace policy, to follow the procedures, and when there is not a policy, the employee should, it might be difficult for the employee, but they have to tell the individual, you need to stop harassing me. It's difficult for some people if they're very timid. It's difficult if it's their manager. Then they have to find ways in which to get around that. And there are some ways that they can do that. They can start to gather evidence, start to document their evidence. Now, of course, this has to be done in such a way that it doesn't seem as if you're trying to set the individual up. But if these things are just happening, you're getting text messages from the individual telling you what they want to do to you. Text messages can be saved. If there's a way to record what the individual is saying to you, we know that there are ways to do that. And if these encounters happen in areas where there are cameras, then you note the times when these things happened so that you can refer when you say, well, at such and such a time this person cornered me and I couldn't get out and I was afraid and then they started touching me and it happened at this time, and you can say, well, check the cameras and see if it didn't happen, I'm not lying. So you start to gather your evidence so that it's not just your word against the individual's word. This particular, the next slide, just pretty much the one after that, yeah. This just really summarizes a lot of what we've said, that there has to be an understanding. One of the main things that people have to understand with the workplace policy too is that there is no retaliation at the end of the day. You shouldn't come back after it's found out. If, for instance, you've tried to prove that somebody has been sexually harassing you, but you were unable to prove it because people did not come forward with their eyewitness accounts for whatever reason, no retaliation. There should be a policy of no retaliation, and that has to be enforced by the management of the company. Has to be. A policy statement should be written, and I just have a sample of a policy statement there. I can share it with you, or Brittany can share it. So most companies, when they have a policy on sexual harassment, they have a policy statement which pretty much shows what the company's view is, and then it continues to go on with what really should happen in terms of that sexual harassment. And we've pretty much come to the end, really. And I'd just like to encourage everyone that you should have a no tolerance to sexual harassment. I know it's difficult sometimes if you're not strong, if you're strong in terms of if you're timid rather, and you're in a very difficult situation, but there's always a way to get to the bottom of it, and there's always a way to solve it. Thank you.
Next we have Ms. Wilma Clement, and for those who were not here for the introduction, she is the Assistant General Secretary of the Barbados Workers Union, and we just had Ms. Diana Douglas, who is the Human Resources Director at Williams Industries.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon we are going to be looking at the aspect of a grievance and how do we treat sexual harassment as a grievance. And within the trade union movement, we say that a grievance is the breaking of an agreement or the law by management or by the worker. And so when we speak of sexual harassment, that grievance can either be against the management or one of your colleagues. It's not necessarily your supervisors or your managers. A grievance can also be the changing of established customs and practices without consulting the union. So in those cases where there are clauses, where there is a policy, that policy in workplaces that are unionized would have been raised and agreed between the union and the workplace. It's not expected then that management changes that agreement in any way without consulting with the union. If they do, then we've got a grievance. It's also a violation of workers' rights, and workers have the right to a safe workplace. So where there is harassment, it certainly is a violation of your rights as a worker. A grievance can be individual or it can be collective. So it could be one person or it can be a group of persons. And sometimes we know that that happens, that within a section or within a department, there is that group of ladies, that group of men who are harassed by someone or someone's, other persons. But very often, because persons are afraid, because they're embarrassed, something must happen so that the others know, hey, I'm experiencing this as well. And then they can agree, let's take this as a group, have that strength in numbers to deal with it. So it could be that one person, or it can be the group that works together. A grievance may be, as I said, between management and worker, or between worker and worker. So your colleagues, the persons who work with you, can harass you as well, and you can lodge a grievance because of that. We've had a definition of sexual harassment, but I'd like to share this definition from the International Labour Organization, the ILO. The ILO defines sexual harassment as any unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which in the reasonable perception of the recipient interferes with work, is made a condition of employment, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. And we say every time that your workplace should be safe. Talk a little bit about some forms of sexual harassment. We talk about the quid pro quo. You do for me, I do for you. You want to go home early, treat me good, I'll let you go home early. You don't want to work the graveyard shift, treat me good, you won't work the graveyard shift. So I'll do something for you, you'll do something for me. But we also have what we call the hostile work environment. And we also see sexual harassment as sexual violence, that's rape. When we talk about the hostile work environment, let's imagine that some of us, or one of us, or let me say go to the nursery to collect my I'll have a grandson. I go to the nursery to collect my grandson. And there's this nice young man who's working at the nursery, and he's waiting with my grandson on his knee. And there are lots of people who will go bonkers when they see that. What is my child doing on your knee? Don't ever let it happen again. Because we don't think a man can take care. In fact, that man has no right working in the nursery unless he's cleaning the yard. And he shouldn't be taking care of children, putting them on his lap or anything like that. So he may be having those challenges with the parents, but also because he's a man and he's working in a nursery, and men don't work in nurseries because they don't do that work. That's women's work. The women in the nursery are saying to him, "You was a sissy. What are you doing in here as a girl? You're a woman? Go find another job. You have no right in here." So they are creating that hostile working environment for him because of his sex. And not that he's making suggestions to anyone, but because of his sex, they have determined this is not a job for you, you have no right here. And it happens. Same thing happens to women. We've seen women now going to construction. Women are now security guards, those kinds of things. And you know, you're told, somebody must want the place clean. You could be a maid. Go do something else. That's what women do. You have no right here. And you get that pressure, you get those comments and the criticisms. They're creating a hostile work environment. And of course, we know the sexual violence. Rape is a form of sexual harassment, but we call it sexual violence. And there's sex discrimination. And very often because of the stereotyping and the way that we classify jobs, that very often you will find one sex or another cannot get a job because, again, as much like the scenario in the nursery or where else, you do not do this because you are a woman or a man. And that too can be a form of sexual harassment. So if we talk a bit about practical considerations, if a grievance is raised and it's brought to the union, it is a very sensitive thing. And we're saying that, one, we have to consider, we want to deal with it quickly. Time really is of the essence with this. You don't want to create within the working environment the idea that perhaps you're not dealing with it, it's not a big thing to you, or because it is so-and-so and not so-and-so, you're tardy. So those are things that we deal with, and we deal with as quickly. That's what we will say to you. We think, let's deal with it. And because we're talking about, as a grievance, we will also have steps in the process, and each step will be time-bound. But we also have to consider, when we talk about practical considerations, that the offender may not work with you at all. It may be that person who's coming to deliver bread. It may be that person who is offering a service, someone who's servicing your air conditioner, someone who is coming in to sell you products. So they're with you very often, but they're not part of your staff. So we have to think about how we will cover our workers when we set up our policies. So do we say to those persons with whom we do business, we don't tolerate sexual harassment from anyone who is doing business with this organization. We expect you to treat our employees with respect when you come here. As I said, you treat the matter seriously and sensitively. I've returned perhaps a little more than a month ago from a congress in Belgium, and I was really very happy, a trade union congress, to learn of a group of my fellow trade unionists from North America dealing with the matter of sexual harassment, and they have launched a program for 1 year in honor of a South African sea cadet, female, Akona Goveza. Sea cadets, again, women don't go to sea, but the women fought and they were accepted. 18 years old, Akona was one of the first sea cadets in South Africa, went on the ship, was harassed by her first mate, the man who's just ordered the captain. She complained to the captain, who didn't take her very seriously. She was raped by the man. She complained to the captain, and he said, okay, we'll meet tomorrow. When tomorrow came, they couldn't find her. When they found her body floating off Croatia. And then it was said, well, the ship is owned by one person in the UK. It was flying its flag in another country. The body was found off Croatia. When they stopped the ship, it was in another country, so who has the jurisdiction? And that was illegal wrangling for months and months and months. And that young lady's family was getting no justice. It took a trade union, worldwide trade union effort to push for something to happen. If it had been investigated in a timely fashion, perhaps she would be alive. But it wasn't taken seriously. We also need to investigate thoroughly and objectively. Yes, it's your friend. You don't gloss it over. Man, you know, we can't take jokes. Didn't mean what he was saying. She's a girl that is befriendly soul. Those kinds of things. Or if it's some person that you do not like, well, that's something that she would do. We know that she like that. If you know that you can't be objective and that you won't do a third job, step away. And as a matter of fact, we are saying when you set up your procedures, you should also account for these things. It will happen. We are human. It could be our friend, it could be our daughter, it could be our sons. So let's make provision for those things. The investigators must have power to act. If you have to report to the board that's going to meet next year at this time, or next month at this time, because the first meeting was yesterday, so you have 4 weeks down for something to happen, that's justice denied. If it is that really and truly the investigator recognizes that that person could do with some urgent counseling, the investigator should have the power to recommend and also to act on those things, to get it done. Help the perpetrator, help the victim. As I said, you should carefully consider the steps and the time limits. We don't want too many steps, we don't want it drawn out. We don't want the time limits either to be too short or too long that the time is either drawn out or it's so short that you can't do a thorough job. So together we will decide. But we want it done, we want to set those limits and that time in such a way that we can get it done thoroughly, but we're not dragging it out, nor are we making it difficult for you to do it thoroughly. So it's something you will sit down and really have a serious discussion about. We also want to resolve the issue and we don't want to conciliate. This could be something that is like a real burning fire in your workplace. So we want to resolve the issue, no matter who the person is, no matter who the perpetrator is, no matter who the person who has alleged or, as you have found, may have been harassed. We don't want the two of you to shake hands and go along, no, you know, because we are all one family in this place. That doesn't work. Sometimes these things then go on the ground. Someone may feel aggrieved, you've done nothing about it, and then all sorts of things can happen. And then when they do, they're much worse than the first thing that was presented to you. So we want to resolve the issues. Whatever needs to be done to make the workplace safe, that is what we will have to do. If we can do these things, we can talk about the benefits of having a policy. And yes, we always recommend that let's sit down and work out a policy. For one, it can be a policy, but you can also have a clause, or you can have them both. A policy is good because then it is quite comprehensive and it sets out, for one, it sets out your intent. It's a written document. It encourages education and training, because I'm sure that one of the things that you will want to do is be sure that everyone understands the issue. People very often say that others are harassed because of the way they look, because of the way they dress. About 22 years ago, a woman in an organization I was working in told me when I complained to her that my boss was sexually harassing me, if you didn't look good, he didn't gonna harass you. I will admit I've not spoken to her since. But I'm trying to move past that. Shouldn't hold a grudge. Shouldn't hold a grudge so long. She really shouldn't. You really shouldn't. But I will also tell you that within 6 months I was out of the workplace. Because they didn't have anything then. My job was being made redundant, and they were changing it, and there were these things that I couldn't do, and this and that, and the next and the third. So we need to make people aware sexual harassment is really about power. not about how I dress and how I look, nor you. Because honestly, we know that when we look at some people, they won't get harassed. If that were the case. What it does is that it provides internal mechanisms for redress. So the workplace has the opportunity to do a customized policy. It's not a this one fits all. We will work recognizing who we are, what you are. We will work a policy that will suit us. It provides remedies for acts of sexual harassment, so I can feel that something is being done. And I think that this one is perhaps the one that organizations will want to demonstrate. It promotes the organization as caring, that it's not only about the dollar and cents, it's not only that bottom line, but you care about the people whom you employ, and you will do what needs to be done to keep them safe and healthy in the workplace. So the policy sends a strong signal that unacceptable behavior will not be tolerated. It promotes respect and dignity at work, regardless of rank. It reduces absenteeism, employee turnover, and promotes a safe workplace. Because very often people can't get work done if there are things on their mind. If they don't feel safe, they'll call in sick. So the goal of the policy would be to have a safe, healthy, and productive workplace. We will want to prevent rather than cure. We don't want it happening here. And if we can't prevent, then we can cure because of what we would have within our policy. And I would want to end by saying it is something that we should all consider. There are lots of examples out there that you can look at and you can use, and you will see the benefits. You will see the benefits of having a policy such as this once you have done it properly and implemented it. And thank you.
Thanks for inviting me, sir, and including us as men. I recently saw someone in the press called gender violence. And although we have the definition of gender, I was not invited, and I noticed there were virtually everybody there was a woman. So we have to be careful. But up to now in this session, I've been hearing the balance that we really need to have. It is men and women, because a lot of men get harassed in ways that women don't get harassed. For example, I don't know if I can say it publicly, some men have had their penises squeezed by women. Just come and hold it and squeeze it. And I don't think that any woman can say that she's had that level of abuse. So I'm glad that in this country we are beginning to say something I said long ago, that a lot of men are subjected to the same kind of problems that the women have. Now, in my case, I'm not going to be speaking very much about the workplace as workplace. My focus is on the legislation. In fact, it's a paper I did way back because we met in the year 2011 with the ministry looking at a 2004 bill. And I checked this evening and I gathered it has not gone further than that. They've been working on it, but I have not seen any progress since the bill in 2004. So that we have here 10 comments that MISA made. We were invited into the ministry at a high level, the permanent secretary, the chief labor officer, a high level. I think 6 people from MISA went in. And it keeps coming back to me now in increasing ways, the authority and the responsibility of groups like MISA, non-partisan, non-political, to guide public opinion and in fact to affect government policy. Because I gather some of the comments have been taken into consideration, but I'm going to say them again. And if the comments, the revision has not taken into consideration, you're going to hear me publicly again coming out and saying these things need to be looked at. And this is how we affect public policy. The comments. MISA has no objections in principle to the proposed legislation, but considers that extreme care should be taken not to include any features which would adversely affect men, for men are likely to be targets of the legislation, given the realities of Barbadian culture, in which men are not likely to go and claim sexual harassment. As a matter of fact, men joke about it and said they joke about it about the police officer where you don't arrest me, where you don't harass me. When men get harassed, they joke about it as though it is something not really something that what kind of man you are. The other man came up and said he was raped. And in fact, the lawyer, doesn't look too happily at men being raped. It says you must have penetration. Although he thought that the rape would mean you're doing something against somebody's will. But men, generally speaking, do not come and claim sexual harassment. And in fact, increasingly, as you heard, you're going to get with it a lot more of the female bosses. The same thing the men were doing, the women have started to do already. And we've had some complaints along those lines. We're concerned that the legislation does not create further hardships for men still writhing, one of those old words, under the provisions of the Maintenance Act, which is 1985. I just calculated it's 29 years old, that in Barbados only a single woman can go to the lower courts of maintenance. It's against the constitutional rights, against the human rights of men. And in fact, we in MISA have to blame ourselves that we have not gone to the law courts to test a piece of legislation that says that only women can do something and not men in terms of maintenance. So we don't want further legislation. As I said, this legislation, 2004, and we met in 2011, and so far as I understand, it hasn't gone. 4 from 14 is 10 years that this legislation has been talked about, and I believe it was talked about before that. Our comments, and some of them, in fact, reflect some of what is being said about what should happen in the workplace. And let me say, MISA also submitted a copy of an actual policy statement from a book we found somewhere, and told them, look, we have something here you could look at in terms of developing. But the specific comments are, there is need for a clear definition of sexual harassment. This evening you heard the Iola thing, conduct of a sexual nature. We criticize that. What is a sexual nature? How can you be saying harassment, sexual harassment of a sexual nature? So we have to define what we mean by sexual harassment. I'll come back to that later, where in fact some of the things you quote, like a picture or a song or whatever, and that you could harass somebody by doing that. The second point we made is the element of repetition must be included as a general rule. A single complimentary remark which is not liked by the person should not be interpreted as a harassment. We should have at least the person saying, I don't like that, don't do that. Although we concede that a single incident may be so extreme as to contribute sexual harassment, somebody grabbing somebody, feeling them up, that would, as one thing, you wouldn't have to do that twice. But we're saying you should not grab on so quickly and say because the body that the person has harassed. I think the reaction of the person to what you said is something that also needs to be looked at. The third thing, all complaints of harassment should be in writing. The legislation did not, and we were embarrassed by the level of that legislation, quite frankly, because even a non-lawyer could look and see it did not say that the thing had to be in writing. So that a person simply come along and say, this body harassed me, and later on say, don't recall. But now this is, don't say, remember, I did not recall. I don't recall. It happened to me a few times. People say something in front of me, I gone ahead on it, and later on the body say, I don't recall. It has to be in writing. If you don't put it in writing, if you can't get somebody to write it for you. The accusation of sexual harassment should be in writing. The draft legislation does not so stipulate. This would help to avoid complaints based on gossip, hearsay, with the possibility of complaints later claiming that they did not recall having said or done certain things. The fourth point we made here is that all complaints should be thoroughly investigated, and I've heard some of the comments on that. And the legislation, surprisingly enough, Clause 6.1 of the draft simply states, where an employer knows or is informed that actions or words that constitute sexual harassment have been directed towards an employee by another employee within the workplace for which the employer has responded, the employer shall issue a written warning to the offending employee on being aware of the offending action or words. It's so fundamentally wrong. The legislation did not mention the word investigate, didn't mention it. after due process, there will be other options than just a written warning. And in fact, as you heard, the thing has to be investigated. Somebody say you do them something like the chap in the car, and that's a fairly common occurrence. One case was a schoolgirl who tore off her own clothes because somebody didn't give her money or want to have some relationship with her. This is happening every day. And it's being drawn to our attention, and sometimes people don't believe what they're hearing. There should be stiff penalties to help to discourage persons from making baseless accusations and then withdrawing them. So we're saying you should have a penalty of a few $1,000s with some imprisonment if you simply bring me out in the open, Ralph Boys, you rape me, Ralph Boys, do something. You ruin my reputation. I'm a reasonable fellow in the country. You can ruin the thing and then suddenly say, I withdraw and I'm bothered with he no more. There must be some penalties that you would think twice. You understand people are objecting to that particular condition. But we're saying unless you have that, you're going to have people deliberately bringing people out in the open, maligning them, and then laughing at them. Similarly, me says unhappy about the clause 15A. The tribunal shall not conduct an inquiry into any matter or shall discontinue a matter that was commenced where the complainant advises the tribunal in writing that the complainant does not wish the inquiry to be held or continued. So I simply bring you out and then I discontinue. We are saying the tribunal should have a discretion in its own authority to say we will continue this investigation and discover that you are the body that was lying on the man, rather than the man having done anything for you. So we're saying that the law should be saying that the tribunal may discontinue, but not that they have to discontinue because you say so. The seventh thing, there should be provision for compensation for persons who are being the subject of baseless accusations. So a person who has been maligned or has been told lies on, he should get some sort of money, a good fat piece of money from whoever came up with the thing. A few thousand, I could do something with 100,000 or something like that. Regarding clause 3, a clear policy should be communicated to all employees in the workplace, not only those on commencement. Again, the legislation said you should, on commencement of employment, give the people a policy. What about the fellow that was there 10 years before? And a simple thing like that, it was embarrassing the level that we've sunk in this country on things that really should be. Nobody should have brought a draft like that to anybody to talk about, unless you could have had it, that it would be something that would be reasonable. You can give them this at the commencement of employment. And what about the people who were there before? So it's not just when they come in, everybody must get. Guidelines should be provided by the ministry, that is Ministry of Labor, and the legislation should make provision for penalties for failing to implement the policy. And I added in my notes at the left that you must have some training, some orientation, because you can't simply put it up there and then find people for not. You must have some training sessions with them as to how you're going to do this thing. The second to last penalty point, I think the word is, we must avoid adopting part of the culture from other countries which would make simple traditional courtesies between men and women in Barbados the subject of litigation. For example, clause 3 says, for the purpose of this act, a person shall be taken to sexually harass another, where that first person mentioned uses sexually suggested words, comments, jokes, gestures, or actions that annoy, alarm, or abuse the other person. So if you come along and say something, you're looking sweet or whatever, then that could be a subject of. We have to be careful on that, because although you heard that some people say it's normal, but some things are normal. It's normal in a lot of cases for people to come and hug up one another. And some people even pop a case. I saw it this evening. And I saw it. I tell the man, don't bother to kiss me. But in fact, the lady said, don't discriminate. One body got, and she said she won't want to. So it's a simple demonstration. It's a simple, pardon? I met you. You met me, okay. So but it's a simple demonstration that in our culture, there are things that we have to be careful, not simply to introduce a bit of thing that people could get, men could get hurt, because essentially is the ladies are going to complain. The men ain't complaining. The man who gets harassed by a woman, he's not complaining at all, even when it's extreme, as the case I told you earlier this afternoon. We clearly need to do much more public discussion and education before finalizing proposed legislation. We must hasten slowly if we are to avoid further unjustified pressure on me. And a final note on the delays, the long delays in the legislation. Everything you see almost the fine for a parent not sending a child $50. The big ups to people who should make the changes are all criticizing the things that are happening in the legal system. All of them, from the top to the bottom. They are criticizing, although their duty is to change. There are three things. They need to farm out the legislation, farm out in terms of giving contracts for people to do the drafting. Because some people who've just retired from the ministry or wherever and have skills in drafting, pay them a few $100 or $1,000 to draft, redraft. The second thing there is need for a review committee, and I gather there's one, but it doesn't seem to be working, to review the legislation on an ongoing basis, and finally an ad hoc working committee to be given instructions, not a thing that you can pay X million dollars, but a particular situation where you say, look, we have these 3 or 4 bits of legislation, the sexual harassment in the workplace, the violence, domestic violence there, 101 that people could be saying, you take these 5. You're skilled already, and there are other legislation in the Caribbean that the Caribbean countries have made the changes already. Sometimes you just need to change Trinidad or Jamaica to Barbados. It is simple as that. But we are making too long delays on the legislation, and justice delayed is justice denied. We got men in prison 10 years without being tried on remand. And we really are abusing people's freedoms and privileges. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
One of the questions that have been engaging the attention of the authorities with regard to the issue of a tribunal is whether we should set up a separate sexual harassment, a separate tribunal on sexual harassment, or whether we should use the existing employment rights tribunal. I must say that if we use the existing employment rights tribunal, it would mean that you will have to go and adjust the Employment Rights Act, because the Employment Rights Act only provides for the for the matters under the Employment Rights Act to be heard by the tribunal. If you go for 2 tribunals, is the issue of costs and duplication and all that. So that is an issue that is addressing the that has the attention of the authorities at this time.
Use both. All right. Yeah, I wanted to direct this question to Mr. Felix, and not in terms of rushing, because it's been about 20 years or so that the legislation has been in draft. So what I wanted to find out, are there any time frames to get it out of the draft? And so that we can have the act in total with everything, not just a first draft. And even if it does mean, and it probably will mean, some more consultations and some more tweaks to it, but is there a time frame that we can look to where this legislation will actually be passed?
Let me start by addressing two points raised by Mr. Hoyt on the question of promoters. And perhaps this is just being lighthearted. That I did hear, Mr. Hoyt, on your station this weekend that a promoter was promoting that the ladies will pay $5 and the men will be admitted free. So maybe that is what I heard. No, I am saying that I heard a promotion this weekend on the radio. I heard the promotion this weekend on the radio that says that the ladies will pay $5 and the men will be admitted free. Good. No. All right. Good. Anyhow, on the question of experiences of other jurisdictions, let me say that both the persons engaged in the technical aspects and the policy aspects would have done their research And then the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel would also have done their research from a legal point of view and then from a policy point of view. So we would be drawing from the experiences, the knowledge, and what is available from other jurisdictions. On the question of timelines, it is an ongoing and recurring reality, as stated, that about the issue about the shortage of legal drafters and the competing areas of interest that are in society. If there's one thing that I can say, that personally I was very happy to see that we were able to get the legislation on the cash for gold through the whole system in rather good time, and it would have, you know. But yes, there's the ongoing issue of the availability of resources, and I did hear the point made when Mr. Boyce spoke about farming out the legislation for preparation, that one of the issues that have been raised there in counter to that is that then the internal persons start to have gripes about the money that the consultants are getting that they would not get if they were doing the work. So that's just the balance of that.
Just want to comment briefly on what Doug would have stated, and to state that as I said earlier, we sit on the National Council of Gender and the National Organization of Women and MISA and other church groups. But what my experience has been is that persons sometimes sit on committees or on bodies, and at the end of the meeting just put this information aside until the next meeting. Because to hear this afternoon when he was just chatting informally, that persons didn't even know that there was a draft, would suggest, and I'm certain to HR professionals here, which most of them are women, you see, Ralph. And this document you should have seen at some point, and maybe in your next time you meet in HERMAB and other organizations, make the sexual harassment in the workplace a topic of discussion. Don't let it end here. Just keep this conversation going, because the only way you can truly protect and ensure that sexual harassment in the workplace becomes a no-no is by putting legislation in place. And we have to drive that movement to ensure that it becomes a reality.
Okay, before we take any more questions, I just have one comment, and this is a question, sorry, to Mr. Felix. So I'm perusing the slides for the Act. I noticed that the impending bill leaves the reprimanding of offenders pretty much up to the internal disciplinary code of the companies. And I think this goes back to what Mr. Hoyt was asking, the scope of what he was asking. How do you police then how internal companies reprimand persons? Because in one company, a guy could grope a lady, and the reprimand for that may be a suspension of a week. But then the reprimand may differ in a different company, and therefore you have, you don't have a level playing field for everybody. You have victims going back into workplaces with offenders, all these things. So is that something the Act in the future is looking to deal with, or will you leave it entirely up to employers to handle?
Thank you, Brittany. One of the questions that Doug, I believe he seemed to don't mind being called Doug publicly, that the policy, that everybody can have a different policy. As you peruse the slide, there is a provision that sets out pretty much that the guidelines for what a policy should contain. So if you follow the guidelines, the policy, it should be, right, there's the first schedule, content of policy statement against sexual harassment. And there are about a dozen or more points about what your policy should. So you don't need to hire a lawyer, you don't need to hire an expert, just follow those guidelines and you should be all right. In terms of the question raised by Brittany, in reality, in our experience, if you have a scenario like that, like this, where you're mediating and you're trying to reach a resolution to a problem, invariably there will be discussion between the whoever is conciliating, mediating, whoever is trying to resolve the problem, and the employer and the other person on the other side, in terms of where we will go from here. So you know, not that everybody would not do exactly the same thing, and that is not necessarily what you're aiming for. But I think in the concepts of law, they talk about the range of reasonable responses, and if the action taken by the employer falls within a range of reasonable responses, it might not be necessarily what you as a person might do, but as long as it falls within that range, then you should accept the employer's position. What I am getting in this legislation and in the Employment Rights Act, there is no provision I have seen that says to you that preempts a person from approaching the courts on any issue. So even with the Employment Rights Act, you can go to the courts if you choose to go that route. All right? And I've not seen any provision in this bill that attempts to preempt your approach to the court.
Yes, I just want to clarify something, because it seems that there's some misunderstanding out there. When we talk about sexual harassment, and I've heard someone makes a remark that you don't like, so you've been sexually harassed. First, let's understand that there's some people who make remarks that you like. So if you like it, you're not sexually harassed. But when it comes to things like saying things, showing things, we say that it should be repeated. There could be one act, if someone gropes you, that kind of thing. And that, they say that is so, I will say devilish, that really and truly you don't want it repeated. So there could be one act. Someone slaps you, someone gropes you, that kind of thing. You don't need it twice. But someone is making suggestive remarks. Then we say in the trade union movement, yes, it needs to be repeated, but you also need to tell the person to stop. You don't like it. Unfortunately, some of us, both male and female, someone says something you don't like, and you laugh. Sometimes it's embarrassment, but you laugh. And the interpretation of that laugh is that you like it. So that's why we say you don't like it. Ask the person to stop. It's when they don't stop, and tell them what you will do if they don't stop. I will report you. But sometimes it's not even that. We had a case at one time where there were two security guards who were working together. They were doing the night shift. Everything was going fine, and the guy left to go by the shop and come back. He went by the shop and got drunk. So when he came back, and the lady was there, he took off all his clothes, and she did not wait. As Barbadians say, she screamed for blue murder and take off. And then she reported him for sexually harassing her. When the investigation was done now, for one, look what he's done to his job. But when the investigation was done, the guy was drunk. He could not defend himself. He had no recollection of what happened. So when they asked him, but you see, no, he's already lost his job. So Don't even let's go there. But it was that one act, and because of his foolish behavior, I mean, he didn't even say anything to her. Apparently, he took off his clothes, she ran, but then he went and he slept. So when the investigation was done, and they talked to the other guys and so on, they realized, and sometimes we aren't, each other's friends. That's what he does. If he gets bored, if he's somewhere where he can't slip to town and so on and come back, he have a drink, and then he prepares to bed by taking off his clothes and finding some place to sleep. So then we had to explain to her, yes, he exposed himself, he took off his clothes, but he was preparing to go to bed. He wasn't sexually harassing you. And as I said, he had no recollection of what happened. So you can't charge him with sexual harassment. I mean, he's exposing himself, yes, but that was not anything directed to her.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that was his question.
What happens in the event of Mr. Boyce's scenario where someone, squeezed the issue? What happens it is offensive, it is sexual harassment. What happens if you like it?
Then it isn't. But you're not. No, it's not. Not if you like it. No. It's harassment is unwanted behavior. You don't want it, but you like the squeeze.
No, you didn't want it, but it happened.
You didn't want it, but it happened.
He didn't object.
And that's also why they talk about the hostile work environment as well. Your work environment that's so imbued with sexuality. There's some people who come in and they talk, especially after the weekend, and they're talking to one another. They've got the pictures up, they're playing the music, they're doing all those kinds of things. That is not directed to any one person. Or sometimes it's the culture in the workplace. I know of a workplace where everybody had a relationship with the boss, every woman. So the woman who came in and refused the relationship with the boss was attacked by the boss and by the other women because she thought she was better than everybody else.
Yes, okay. I can probably borrow yours. I just want to make a quick plug. We have within our forte of things we do disseminate lots of, and our members would be familiar with the templates and the guidance notes and so on that we disseminate. We are in the process of reinventing the sexual harassment template, pamphlet that we had. I have formally written to the United Nations to have some assistance in terms of building the content for the pamphlet. So it is on my agenda to have this reinvented and printed and disseminated to members, whether via soft copy or hard copy, by the end of the year. So there is also something, tangible that you can build your policies off of, and whenever the draft is made available, that can be guidance as well. But until then, we are trying to build something for you guys to have something to base your policies off of. So that, just to let you know, that's coming sometime soon. If there are no further comments, queries from anybody at this time, I will invite Ms. Nilita Gajada to make some remarks before I make the closing remarks.